Okay, so welcome to today's DH colloquium by Roald Eiselen. Ach, your tagger is useless, a case study of domain transfer for part-of-speech taggers in two South African languages. I think that sounds very interesting. Just to introduce Roald, Roald Eiselen is a lecturer and a researcher in language technology and computational linguistics at the Center for Text Technology, CText, at Northwest University. He started his working career in the US at the Natural Language Processing Group of Microsoft. This was from 2006 to 2013, before returning to the Northwest University, where he focuses on the development of language resources and technologies for South Africa's indigenous languages. Roald was partially involved in the establishment of SADILER, where we hosting this DH colloquium, and acted as the technical manager there from 2017 to 2019. His current research focuses on leveraging language technologies and computational techniques to inform traditional linguistic research while still training way too many taggers. And I think we'll hear about these taggers just now. Roald, I know you popped out for a second. I hope you're back.
I am indeed.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. You're welcome to share your camera as well if you want. Yep, great.
Yeah, so
Let me stop my share and then you can take over.
Thank you. Let me see. Share and just confirm that you can see the sharing.
Yep, I can see your screen.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. And thank you for the introduction and the invitation. And thank you to everybody for joining us this morning, where I will be presenting work by myself and Dr. Tanya Gouwstad. And her name is in brackets because I couldn't convince her to confirm that her name should be on the slide, opening slide this morning. But she was central to the work that I'll be presenting today, which we hope to have published in the very near future. So I actually changed the title of my talk this morning to be a little bit more emphatic about some of the feedback that we've received, and which is valid, from various people on how various types of taggers actually perform when you send them out into the wild. And based on some work that especially Tanya did on acquiring additional data, we then did a case study for isiZulu and Sesotho sa Leboa, or Sepedi, or Northern Sotho, to determine what the impact of switching between domains has on these types of taggers, and then hopefully to also look into if there are indicators of why these taggers perform so much worse. So first off, just a little bit of contextualization. So I work in natural language processing and language technology, tool development, and the idea behind these tools are that they're supposed to be assistive. By allowing researchers or developers to process vast amounts of data rather than doing everything by hand. And this allows various development and research areas to process these large amounts of data and find, hopefully, underlying and more complex patterns on large data sets. So I've got a couple of examples of where these types of tools have been used in the past. So using stylistic cues in the works of a particular author, using pos tagging and parsing just as examples for something like authorship identification, or doing analysis of character relationships in novels, which we'll chat about a little bit in a second, where you might use named entity recognition, co-reference resolution. more linguistically oriented, doing more theme productivity research, would require, well, not require, but would benefit from good morphological analysis. And then something that I'm partially getting interested in the motion at the moment is the detection of large language model generated texts, where something like dependency parsing or Biber features, which can be automatically extracted, can inform um, researchers on how to detect these kinds of texts. Now, the problem is that, and I include myself in this kind of a very self-deprecating presentation, but it is the state of the world, is we often report relatively to very high accuracy on the tools that we train. But when these are applied in the wild and in different contexts and different domains, um, they often perform much worse. And hopefully this talk will give you a little bit of insight into why that is, as well as some strategies for mitigating that kind of performance loss, and how to manage the expectations of what you get when you use these types of technologies. Um, we're focusing specifically on pos tagging for a number of reasons. Firstly, we were able to get some data, which is a very important part of it. But it's also a very well understood technology. It's been around for decades. There's been various ways of approaching this. But it's also a tool that can be used in a lot of different other downstream tools. So if you want to do parsing, you're likely to need, or syntactic parsing at least, you're likely to need part of speech and accurate part of speech tagging. Same goes for named entity recognition, GAN assist, morphological analysis and lemmatization, as well as dependency parsing. So kind of all of the things that I mentioned in my examples above. So the kind of loss in accuracy that you see when you switch between domains is also been a very well established and used to be a very well researched area of NLP across a variety of technologies and different applications. Although it has kind of subsided in the last couple of years with the advent of the deep neural networks and specifically embeddings, which I'll say about a little bit more in a second. This kind of accuracy loss is also not limited to what we see as low resource languages. So those are languages that don't have a lot of annotated data or don't have a lot of data available in the language. But this is also prevalent in languages like English, Dutch, German, when something like English, where something like pos taggers are typically trained on parts of the Wall Street Journal, which is obviously a newspaper. When that is applied to something like biomedical texts or to social media posts on Facebook and Twitter and the like, their accuracy decreases usually substantially. And our hypothesis, but more our experience is that it's likely much worse for low resource languages because you're starting off from a relatively lower baseline and the amount of data is limited. The impact of going to a completely different domain will likely have a larger effect. So I might have mentioned some of this already. The aim of our work and of this talk is to perform an analytic analysis of the impact of domain change across 5 different domains. And I'll explain all of the different domains that are involved here and how we did the experimental setup in a couple of slides. We're doing it specifically on two typographically distinct low resource languages, isiZulu and Sesotho-Seleboa, with the idea of addressing four issues. Determining what the accuracy loss is when switching between different domains, what the impact is of adding relatively or two types, very little and relatively small amounts of in-domain data, as well as the impact of adding only additional out-of-domain data. So still ignoring the domain that the target domain, but rather just making every set of data that's available part of the training process. And then I'd like this to serve as a little bit of a cautionary tale for researchers and developers as well, in terms of evaluation results that you typically see in papers, and what the expectation should be if you're applying that to a domain on which the data was not, or on which the taggers weren't trained. So how do you solve the problem? Well, it's pretty simple. Annotate a whole bunch of in-domain data, train a new tagger, and you should have a tagger that comes close to what was originally reported. Two problems with this is that it's typically prohibitively expensive and time-consuming to do this tagging. So tagging multiple thousands of words accurately requires expert annotators who don't want to spend their entire lives just annotating, but have other jobs as well. And needs a lot of training, and it's a very cumbersome process. And to target where to focus this type of annotation effort, you need to determine how much and what types of data you need to annotate to improve your in-domain accuracy. Now, as I mentioned before, there's been a bunch of work previously done. There were two main kinds of approaches to doing domain adaptation. The first group focused on methods looking to automatically adapt the training set to the new domain. And one of the prevalent approaches there was to use multiple taggers to tag the target domain data. And any cases where there is complete agreement between the taggers, those sentences would then be included in training data and accepted as that would improve in-domain performance. And this does show small improvements, but part of the problem there is that if the taggers are already confident about their tag assignment, then it's likely that they've previously encountered similar data. And so that this doesn't necessarily improve as much as some of the other strategies. The second set of approaches focused on the distributional characteristics of the respective data. So looking at the training data of the tagger itself, and then the distributional properties that you have in the target domain, and then either select data to specifically target things that include specialist terminology, or sentences or documents that have a high out-of-vocabulary rate. So what I mean by out-of-vocabulary is during the training process, at least traditionally, if a word was not seen in the training data, then the tagger model didn't specifically know anything about that word. Now, it would still assign a part-of-speech tag given the context, but a lot of information is lost because it had never seen that particular word used in a sentence or in multiple sentences. The other kinds of approaches added ambiguity classes and distributional features of the target domain data as pre-processed features to the tagger that is then trained. And those also showed some improvements. For the selection of data with a high out of vocabulary rate, in some instances, there were reports of improvements, absolute improvements of more than 10%. So this seemed like one of the strategies that we would investigate. And as you'll see in my experimental design, it's also something that's relatively widely used. Um, as I briefly mentioned, most work on well-resourced languages has kind of been superseded over the last 5 to 8 years, not just in pos tagging, but in several other areas as well. Partly because the reliance on only the training data for the vocabulary of the language has been supplanted by embeddings, and the various flavors of these embeddings, which are trained on much larger data sets. So most words have some contextual information and have a representation in the embedding space. And even though it's not specifically been assigned a part of speech tag, those embeddings typically are supposed to relate or focus the word in the same area that similar words do. And part of that representation would typically be something like the part of speech, or if it's a named entity, would end up in a similar space to named entities. Just a quick note on the languages that we're focusing on. So both of these are Niger-Congo B languages, but they have distinct orthographic properties which made them particularly interesting for this work. In that isiZulu is conjunctively written, so all morphemes of a linguistic word are contained in a single orthographic token, whereas Sesotho-Saleboa is disjunctively written. So in some cases, a linguistic word can consist of multiple orthographic words. And I have an example at the bottom there, which are two translations of I love him, her. Now, Kiamurata in Sesotho-Saleboa, in Ngiyamthanda in isiZulu. And so, as you hopefully can see, the Kiamurata has morphemes and concords that are associated with uh, the well, with love, whereas all of those components, the same components, are contained in a single word for isiZulu. Then just a quick word on the tag sets. So on the right-hand side, you should see there's main part of speech categories for isiZulu and Sesotho-Saleboa. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see that for some of those major parts of speech, so 20 for isiZulu and 26 for Sesotho-Saleboa, there are a number of sub tags associated. And these are because of the noun class system. So in the systems that we trained and that I'm presenting here today, we do distinguish the noun class assignments on something like the adjectives, the nouns, etc. And that complicates things slightly as you're dealing with much larger tag set. And the more tags you have, the fewer examples there are in the training data. And consequently, it's likely that you will perform worse. In comparison, typical English sets contain 36 to 48 tags, where those 12 additional tags are usually associated with punctuation, symbols, and numbers. And so the baseline for these taggers are already slightly more difficult. There is what is known as a universal part of speech tag set that I think was developed at Google and Stanford, which only has 18 classes, which simplifies some of this complexity. And although there have been efforts, well, there are data sets released based on these on this universal tag set. It's difficult in some instances, and Tanya can answer some questions on that if she needs to. On assigning something like the demonstrative class or the copy, I'm looking for something like the possessive concord to these universal tag sets. Now, on the domains and the data sources themselves that were used in the experiments that I'll be presenting. Firstly, there's the main source of data for a lot of language technology development, at least in South Africa and within our center, come from data from the government domain. And so these are typically samples of data from websites from gov.za and the various departments in the government, and consists of a combination of formal legislative texts, some pamphlets and informational content, as well as some school learner material. That's usually, well, in this case, our baseline domain is then a very broad domain in the government, but it also has a number of stylistic features, which we'll see in the next slide. The second domain that we included, data source that we included, was data from the National Senior Certificate Examinations for first language or home language exams, where students were asked to do reading comprehension or summary writing parts, were the summary portions of the exam. And the texts that are then associated with either doing the reading comprehension or the summary writing were included in this. These texts are supposed to be at a certain reading level, should not usually include too much terminology and so on. But I think as one of Menu's students in the past has shown that's not necessarily the case. But in either case, it is freely available, so it is a valuable resource for us. This third set that we used was a magazine called Pula Mvula, which contains educational articles for developing farmers to turn them into, or to provide them with information to become successful long-term farmers. And until 2024, this was published in 5 languages, which included Sesotho and isiZulu. Unfortunately, they are not producing these in the African languages anymore, and it's only being published in English going forward. Then we also included news articles, which is a more broader general audience with a broader range of topics, but possibly with a simpler linguistic style. The fourth target domain that we included was novels from fictional literary works from 2 South African publishers. Where we used data from 3 novels in each language, which were obfuscated so that we could get permission to use these data sets. And unfortunately, we don't know exactly what the target audience of these novels were, but we could at least see what impact they have in the domain switch that we're interested in at the moment. And then lastly, we selected some sentences from language and literary studies PhD theses from the University of Pretoria and University of KwaZulu-Natal, which were written in the respective languages. So I just need a quick bit of water. So here's a summary of the extent of the data, along with some descriptive statistics. And there are a couple of things that I want to highlight here. So firstly, uh, the fact that isiZulu and Sesotho Soleboa are conjunctively and disjunctively written can be relatively easily seen if you look at the Gov training data, for instance. So the original idea with the annotated data sets is that these would be parallel data sets, starting with an English corpus consisting of approximately 50,000 words. And then we would select the parallel text in the other South African languages. Immediately, you can see that 50,000 or approximately 50,000 words in Sesotho Soleboa equates to 65,000 approximately words, which is substantially more than the 44,000 that it would be for isiZulu. You can also see that the respective type counts, so even though Sesotho Soleboa has much more data in terms of tokens, the unique words in those training sets are far fewer for Sesotho Soleboa, more than half less than, for instance, for isiZulu. Then there's a government test set. So when we're training the POS taggers, we look at one part of the data to train the model, and we have a completely separate test set of data that the model has not previously seen, and which is typically what we use to evaluate and publish results on. Now, in addition to that, we have the 5 different genres, domains, sorry, not genres, also listed there. And you can see that there's some variance in the amount of data that was available for us to annotate. And that's something that I only last night really thought that might have an impact on this as well. But looking at the results, it didn't seem to be too indicative of the accuracy loss that we'll see in a second. And then on the right-hand side, one other interesting fact for the tokens per sentence, for the government training data and for the test data, the typical number of words in a sentence is substantially larger than for most of the other domains. And it might be as extreme as even half the number of words in the novels for isiZulu. Which may be indicative of the stylistic characteristics of the data in this government set, and might be also something that to consider when thinking about what is impacting the quality. So we did 4 sets of experiments for each language. Firstly, we took a baseline tagger trained only on the government domain data, and then purely applied it to each of the different domain data sets. That would give us the baseline impact of switching between domains. Then we followed some of the earlier work by selecting a very small sample of the data, but that included high rates of out-of-vocabulary words. Now, to balance this slightly, we didn't just take the 10% with the highest out-of-vocabulary rate. We selected the 20%, and then from that 20% sample. The reason for that is that when we're doing the evaluation on the held out set after training with this additional 10%, we still wanted sentences with high OV rates in there, so that that's not unduly using only the most difficult data to train and then seeing inflated results there. Then the third experiment, we looked at what would it look like if we used most of our training data, which is simulating domain adaptation for the taggers. We did this using tenfold cross-validation. So stepwise across the entire data set, we used 90% of the data as part of the training set, and then tested on a held out set of 10% of the data. And then lastly, we performed an experiment to use all of the out-of-domain data. So if we're focusing on PhDs, we'd include CAPS, magazines, news, and novels in the training set, and then only evaluating on the in-domain data to see what it would look like if you completely disregard the domain that you're interested in and just added random data to the training process. On the little bit of the technical side, we trained these taggers using bidirectional long shell-term memory conditional random field neural part-of-speech taggers. These are possibly not state-of-the-art anymore, but previous experiments around transformer-based architectures did not yield the same level of results as these in the under-resourced scenario that we're looking at. We used two different embeddings for isiZulu and for isiZulu, based on previous research that myself and Dr. Gaustad did. These were trained for 80 epoch, and then perhaps more importantly, in each case, we trained from scratch. It was not taking 10% of the data and fine-tuning an existing part-of-speech tagger. Part of the reason there is that during the training process, the data is randomized, and so it would see what the results would look like or what the results would be if you're trying to improve the tagger without just fiddling with the last, with a post-process. And adding a small amount of data and fine-tuning, especially in low-resource environments, can be problematic because it's then only adapting values that are specifically related to the instances that are in your smaller data set. Okay, now to the crux of the situation. So on the screen, I have both isiZulu and isiZulu accuracy results across the 5 domains at the bottom. And we have a baseline perforated line, like blue line, which is the results that the taggers attained when trained on the government domain and tested on the government domain. So purely applying the government domain trained tagger on these different domains, you can immediately see that you're losing accuracy across the board for all 5 of these domains. There is either minimal, maybe in magazines case, but for the case of novels, you're losing between 10 and 12 percentage points of accuracy in absolute terms. And so if you apply the POS tagger that was trained only on the government domain data, and you applied it to novels, it is going to look terrible. And you will be angry at the developers and say that they shouldn't be doing what they're doing. And this to some degree is true, but the nature of novel data is so different from the source that it is, not to a degree, it should be expected. And this is the cautionary part, is that if you're thinking about applying almost any language technology, then you can see results that may be similar to this. I didn't think I was going to take so long, so I'll move along a little bit quicker. So in the second set of results, we, as explained earlier, used 10% of the data, tested on the remaining 90%. And as we can see, there's mostly small improvements. In some cases, like novels, you can even get half of the lost accuracy essentially back. moving up from something like 77 to 83 odd in the case of isiZulu for novels, and getting back into the 90% range for Sesotho sa Leboa. But it's not across the board for all domains. So for magazines, for instance, on the Sesotho sa Leboa side, adding this small amount of data actually decreases the accuracy slightly when compared to the loss with the baseline tag. Now, when we're adding a lot more data, so this would range between 3.5 or 4,000 to 8,000 tokens, we can see that that does provide marked improvement. And unfortunately, fortunately, this is again an indication that adding data in the domain is most likely the best way of improving the quality of your taggers. I don't think I saw any anomalous results, apart from the fact that adding this much in-domain data does actually produce taggers that perform better on the in-domain set than they do on the original government-trained government test set. And for the novels, you are at the point where it's almost back to where the reported results would be. And then the last set of results, we're just adding all of the out-of-domain data. So that would be in the order of about 20 to 25,000 tokens, depending on the language, but none of the in-domain data. So for isiZulu, there is a small improvement for caps, but for novels, this doesn't improve anything, because it's unlikely that any of the other domains have a similar style to what you would typically find in novels. This is also similar for Sesotho sa Leboa. So the last thing that we tried to look at was, what are the characteristics of the target domain that causes this loss in accuracy? And we only looked at kind of surface level features when considering this, partly due to the fact that I don't think it's the best idea to try to find a underlying cause by using a different NLP tool to process the data, and then draw conclusions based on that. So we only looked at the source data in the target and the source domain, and looked specifically at the out-of-vocabulary rates, as that's something that has been that is often presented in results. Then we also looked at range vocabulary divergence. So rather than just looking at the percentage of tokens that are not in the training data, this is a measure of the difference in relative frequency of tokens between two data sets. Then we also looked at part of speech relative frequency differences, both on the individual pause level and in pause sequences. As this is something that we, during the annotation process, it was noticed that there were unique part of speech sequences, and this might be an indication of where the problem originates. As I mentioned earlier, there is some discrepancy in sentence length, and this is partly possibly interesting purely from the fact that when in modern taggers you are considering a particular token, you do take into consideration the entire preceding sequence, or up to a limit, but the limits are beyond the length of the sentence that we were looking at. And so if you have shorter sentences, then that might have some impact on this as well. And then just for completeness sake, we also included type token ratio in our statistical analysis. So we applied the forward stepwise regression procedure to identify which of the variables that I just mentioned might be indicative of the quality of the tagger, and this basically adds predictive variables until there's no predictive variable, which would make a statistically significant improvement. And it also does not include highly correlated variables. So something like Renyi, divergence, and out of vocabulary rate are highly correlated. So those two wouldn't be included in the same model. For both languages, the strongest predictors were, in both cases, the distributional divergence and the bigram pos distribution divergence. Although all of the other variables except for TTR show statistically significant results, they don't account for enough of the variability in the results to be considered trustworthy, especially since this is a relatively small sample that we're working from. So not new, but confirmed, is that if you know what your distributional divergence is, there is a good chance that you would be able to get a fair idea of how well your pos tagger is going to perform. There's just an example of the distribution of the out-of-vocabulary rate across the texts that we used. And you can see that there's a negative relation. So as the out-of-vocabulary rate decreases, the accuracy of the taggers increase. So in summary, switching domains will almost certainly result in severe loss of accuracy, but this is especially the case in low resource scenarios where your baselines are relatively low and the impact of data that's not been seen before might be more severe. But adding even a relatively small amount of training data can substantially reduce this loss in accuracy. And there are relatively simple textual characteristics that may be good indicators of how this accuracy will be influenced. So fortunately or unfortunately, if you intend to use tools like this, you will likely need to retrain with some target domain data, but that has luckily become substantially easier over the last 5 to 10 years. And that is my story. Thank you very much for your time. And if there are any questions, myself, and I hope Tanya is here as well. Yes, I see her. Will be happy to answer.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, that was a very interesting presentation. Not sure if there are any questions. I don't see anything in the chat yet, but perhaps you can just raise your hand and then we can discuss. I actually have a few questions myself, but I don't want to hog the discussion. Okay, let me just quickly start so people can kind of try to formulate their languages in their heads already. I'm not sure if you know of an almost ancient article from 1998. Quite ancient, called the compare the present use of the present use of statistics in the evaluation of NLP parsers. That was by Entwistle and Powers. I'm not sure if you know that. So they did a very similar thing. They looked at the performance of part-of-speech taggers. So remember, mid 90s was the area where, or the time era where people looked at part-of-speech taggers and parsing and stuff like that. And the performance was extremely high. You get accuracies in the high 90s. And I think they were at least the first to present it, to actually test one of these top performing parsers. And they applied it to Alice in Wonderland, if I remember correctly. And the performance was dramatic. So you call the accuracy drop you had already pretty bad, but this was way, way worse. I think that was quite an interesting read as well. And I think what you're doing is very similar to what they're doing in the general sense, right? The focus is different, the techniques are different. So it might be interesting to compare that as well.
Yeah, so 2 points on that. Firstly, I think that, and especially in the high resource languages, where the language modeling that they're doing may be able to, pretty sure, be able to improve those results because those aren't out of vocabulary anymore, and it's seeing sequences that are similar to what you would find in novels, and that's why I mentioned that for a lot of these languages, higher resource languages, it's not something that's as prevalent anymore. But prior to the kind of modern deep neural revolution, um, even with one of the best versions of the Stanford parsers in 2012 odd, they applied this to biomedical text and to social media text, and the reduction in accuracy was also, I think, something like, because for Stanford they were reporting about 97 or 98% accuracy, and it came down to the low 70s even. So it may still be relevant, especially in those contexts, although I think that the architectures have had some impact on how these perform.
Yeah, yeah, no, exactly. I see there's a question from Benjamin Chipster. Could you define exactly what is meant by a tagger? Unfamiliar with the term.
So tagging is any classification has a host of classification tasks. In this particular case, we're referring to a model that automatically applies or classifies individual words to their respective part of speech categories. So is this a noun for any given sentence? Is this a noun? Is this a verb? But there are other kinds of taggers as well. Sorry, all of the taggers, most of the tagging that I was referring to was related to pause tagging. But named entity recognition as well is also a tagging task in the sense that it is applying or assigning a class or a tag to each of the individual words, and there are a host of others that are used in NLP as well.
Wonderful. I think that helps. Um, I actually had another question. I think you kind of skipped over that. It might be a very simple one. So you described the data collections in the different genres. Um, I didn't really get where you actually got the part of speech tags from for these data sets. So did you manually annotate this? Did you get people to do this, or did you do this semi-automatically, or is there a special trick to do this? And I assume it's a lot of manual work. Can you then give a bit of a sense of how difficult that task is and how much work that is?
I could to some degree, but if she does not mind, Tanya
I
is the expert
assume,
on
yeah.
this part of things, so maybe she can say more on that.
Yeah, sure. No worries. So the part of speech tag set is something that has been evolving for quite a while. So the part of speech tags that we're using for this particular data set is based on the original NCHRT data set. A part of speech tag set, sorry, but we have refined it a few years back. So in 2020, there was a project where we refined the data set and where we made the tag sets as compatible between the different South African languages as we could. I know it's not possible for 100%, but yeah, we tried and aligned them as much as possible. So that's the data set that we used. It's also available on the cellular repository for whoever's interested in reading about it. So we shared it and it's out there, and people are free to use it and to refer to it. So that's a tag set. But regarding the annotation, so what we do pre-annotate the data with our taggers. But as you saw from Roald's talk, that means, yeah, someone still has to go in and test and check and make sure the assigned tags are actually what they need to be. And for that, we do use linguistic experts that we've been working with for ages now. But it's quite yeah, it's quite a lengthy process. I mean, for whoever has done annotation knows it takes a lot of eye for detail to actually do annotation. But we do have tools for that. So we have the Lara tool that we use, and that's what the annotators do their corrections in. We've also devised a process actually where if we're 99% certain that a tag is correct, we'll actually sort of blend it out so it's not as prominent for the annotator, and we make them focus on the tags where we know there's probably issues and that need to be amended by them. So yeah, but I mean, it's a process. I'm just thinking, so this was a pilot. The data we did this study on was a pilot. We're now doing the full Monty basically for all the languages. And we've been busy for 6 months with annotating, which includes QC and back and forth for questions, etc. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh, thanks. No, it does. It does. Thanks.
Perhaps
Is there
just
any other?
one
Sorry,
addition. Sorry. On the tag sets themselves, it's not something that myself and Tanya or anyone at CTEX comes up with. These are also done in depth with various linguistic experts, professors from various universities where available, and so they are credited and are centrally involved in that process as well.
Great, thank you. I'm not sure if there are any other questions. I see the chat's still relatively empty. You don't have to be shy. Just ask questions. I don't see anything. I actually still have another question. We have a few more minutes, so that's fine. I was actually wondering, so now you're comparing two South African languages and their low resource in a sense. The data sets were very small. I mean, I know it's a lot of work, but these are not massive data sets.
No.
So how do you think if you do this for one of the large languages, for the languages for which a lot of data is available, and you compare kind of similar genres, will you get similar results? So if we do this for English orthography might look more like Sesotho than isiZulu, I guess. Will it look similar, or is the low resource part of the languages, is that sort of small data sets, is that part of the issue here?
So it's definitely part of the issue. So for English, the taggers that are trained on hundreds of thousands of tokens of text. And so starting off with something that only has 50,000 and is in a very specific domain already impacts that, because even if you just keep scaling up the amount of data, then you're more likely to see particular sequences of words or sequences of part of speech. And so my expectation would be that the results would not be as dramatic, except if you're moving into a very technical domain. So I know on the biomedical side, they saw these substantial losses. This is years, well, a decade ago, so it might not be as substantial anymore. But there is enough of this type of degradation that there is still some ongoing work around quantitative methods to improve these. But my expectation would be that you wouldn't see as much of a degradation, and the improvements would then also require a larger amount of data. So in our case, give or take, it's approximately 10% of the data that's added per domain. So that's a relatively substantial amount of data in the entire training set. Whereas for English, to see similar improvements, you might need to tag a lot more. And that was what previously was found as well, as they need in the order of 25 to 30,000 tokens per domain to see the types of improvement that would get it closer to on par with the originally reported results.
Very wonderful, thanks. Oh, that's quite interesting. I see Marissa, I'm not sure if that's really a question, says, please keep us updated on the publication of this research. It's definitely much needed to help explain what we see practically in so many other experiments. Thank you very much for the presentation. Oh, wait a minute, Chrismy's just adding, doesn't show well here. Indeed, I'm thinking of the extra layer of complexity added for annotation for signed languages. Yeah, we've kind of skipped over that at all, but that will be interesting as well. So I'm not sure if this, because this was in press, right? So if this is published, I'm sure you'll kind of share this broadly, so we all all get this information.
Yeah. So as I said, hopefully in the next couple of months, depending on the process, we should have this finalized. And I might make it available to you so you can add it to the blurb of this talk as well.
Yeah, wonderful. I'll do that. I think we're running out of time now. I'm not sure if there's one more quick question. And if not, then I would quickly checking. Don't see any additional questions. But then I would really like to thank you, Roald, for an interesting presentation. It's really something to think about what we can do and how we can handle this. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate it. And thank you for the help, Tanya.
You're more than welcome.